Redefining Yourself is a podcast for those ready to reclaim their power, embrace transformation, and consciously create their next chapter. Through honest conversations, soulful insights, and practical wisdom, each episode explores what it means to choose yourself, release limiting beliefs, and navigate life's transitions with courage and grace. Hi, everyone. I am Debbie Kennison, and this podcast, can we just talk about my decision to do this podcast? Here's my intention for this podcast, and this is something that I've been wanting to do for 7 years, and it just felt like this was the time. And I think there are a couple of reasons why that's true for me. But right now, this particular podcast that I wanted to do, and you'll notice that in the title of my podcast, it is called Redefining Yourself. And that's intentional. I came up with those words a few years ago, and that's a whole nother story about redefining yourself. But part of the reason that it feels really important right now to do this podcast, to talk about the ways that we can, and I don't want to use the word should, but I do. I think the time is now for us to really start to look at how we can redefine ourselves. So one of the reasons that I decided to do this now is that if you just look at the state of the world right now, and we just take that, what's happening, what we're seeing, what we're experiencing on both the human level and as an individual and a collective level, is that it seems to me that we have lost our way. And it seems to me that we're at this intersection. We're at this inflection point where we need to figure out how to be better at being human. And we also could use a little bit of a reminder on what it means to truly be divine and to understand all that that looks like. And so that was part of the reason that I really wanted to do this right now. And there's a second part to this that feels really important. And, I'm using the medium right now that it's electronic. It's not analog. It's a digital format. It's using computers. It's using technology. And yes, it can make our lives as humans better, but there's also a side of technology that I know for me has felt, I've felt conflicted about it, right? About introducing technology into my life as a human being in a way that allows me to retain my humanity, my humanness. And we're seeing issues with technology, and that's a whole big topic right there. We could do an entire podcast on that, and I probably wouldn't even do it justice. But I think if we take a look at all the ways that we use technology, and look, I doom scroll just as much as anybody else. I try not to, but literally I can feel that my brain has changed. And you have to remember, I'm 62, so I came alive at an age where, television was pretty new. And landlines, we used landlines like rotary dial phones, and you had to be really patient around that. And, I was in that space where I grew up without any real technology to where we are now. And I know that in the next 20, 30 years of my life, technology is going to go so much further than what we ever imagined. And I admit that scares me a little bit. that is, it doesn't intimidate me, I would say. It's not intimidating. But here's the thing, is that we cannot, in my mind, in my body, I think we lose the connection. It's really easy to lose your connection to your own body and to your own mind and even the shape of your heart when technology dominates most of your time and most of your day and most of your energy. And so I think we are at an inflection point in terms of humans and technology and how we use it. And we know there are pitfalls to it. There's many pitfalls to technology, just as much as there are being human. And I think we have to figure out a way to navigate that. And look, I think it's helpful if you kind of understand where I'm coming from. So I'll give you my spiel here. But first and foremost, I am a human being. So are you. We have that in common. I am a woman. You may or may not have that in common with me, but, there it is. And I am somebody who always identified with having a body, with experiencing my body, with living from a place of what was happening in my body. So you could say I'm a very embodied person. I'm somebody who, if we talk about what this podcast is really about, that's part of it, is how are we having a human experience and knowing that we're divine beings? And what does that really mean? Because that means there's two different sides to you, and you're trying to figure out how to marry those two. And, the divine part to me is the easy part. It's the human part that gets really messy and really hard. And so knowing that, and knowing that for me, my body was always the place that I wanted to come from, that I wanted to live from. And so from a very young age, like I always say, dance was my first language. And the reason is that as a younger child, I didn't have the words and I didn't have the ability to emotionally express what I was feeling, what I was experiencing in my body. But dance allowed me to express that. Dance allowed me to convey a message and to show you how I was feeling. And even though I was not a great dancer, I would say I was very mediocre, but that didn't stop me from wanting to explore movement and wanting to express the way I was feeling. And for most of us, I think that we can, on some level, relate to the fact that, how did we relate to our bodies when we were kids, right? We were biking, swimming, running, doing so many things, moving so much with our bodies. And the interesting thing about that for me is that for most people, they just didn't think about it, right? They didn't think about moving all that much, and they didn't really, I think, have this experience of checking in with their body and having some sense of what was going on inside. And for me, the only limitation for me was language. But somehow I was always interpreting what that felt like and what was going on in my body. And I was very sensitive as a kid. And I had a lot of gut issues. That's, one of the experiences that I think defined a lot of my childhood, was always having issues with my digestion, with my gut. And it was only later in my life that I discovered part of the reason that was because my nervous system was pretty much in a perpetual state of fight or flight. So, fun fact, that's a fun thing to really figure out later in your life. I think my family always defined themselves as like, yeah, we're just high anxiety people. We're always anxious. Yeah, that's not normal. So, we didn't know that was a problem until much later in our lives, and it's a problem. And so if you can identify with the fact that, yeah, I was kind of an anxious kid, or I'm an anxious adult, I've been anxious my whole life, I want to tell you that that's actually not normal. You're not supposed to be that way. Sorry to be the one to tell you that, but that is in fact a fact. So, going through childhood, somewhat anxious, always moving, and I'm sure a lot of it was me trying to move energy, trying to shift the way that I was feeling, which is a beautiful thing. By the way, it's one of the most extraordinary things about being human, I think, is that we have the ability to change the state that we're in. If we don't like the way that we feel and the state that we're in, we can change it. And that's great news. That is such good news. So fast forward a few years later, I have a serious accident where, and I don't talk about this a lot, a few people know this about me, but when I was going to college, I was on the way to class, and I was met on the sidewalk at a turn by somebody coming down a hill, and I was trying to turn and go up the hill. And I had two choices. I could go in the street to crash my bike, or I could choose this little planter bed where, it was just dirt between the concrete and the street. And I chose that. And when my front bike tire hit that, I ended up sailing through the air like Superwoman, and I landed on my chin first and then the rest of my body. And thank God I had a helmet on, but it really didn't do much other than just drive the chin strap into my chin. So I get up, think I'm okay. I get ready to go to class, walking my bike. I can't ride. I'm in a state of shock, and I arrive at the class, and I'm just pretty much out of it. But it turns out that what had happened was I had dislocated my jaw, and I had pinched a nerve in my neck, which then caused 3 years of dealing with a jaw that was non-operable. So what they had to do, they didn't want to do surgery, thank goodness, but what they did do was they put these spacers in my mouth, so I had to wear them for 3 years to hold my jaw open, essentially, to allow everything to relax. And it took every bit of 3 years for it to do that. And thank God I didn't break any teeth. It seemed like, okay, this is the worst of it, not bad. But what ended up happening over those course of 3 years is I lived with migraine headaches every day for 3 years. The pain was, I lived on aspirin, which nobody told me was not a good thing. I went through many, investigative medical things trying to figure out how to help me. At that time, it was crazy to me that they didn't know how to fix a pinched nerve in my neck. And so what would happen is it was mostly the left side of my body, which we'll talk about that in a minute. But I ended up with a left arm that I couldn't use. It was basically dead. My fingers turned blue. They were always blue, always cold. They would tremor. And I probably still have, there's a little bit of a tremor still there today, every now and then. And my shoulder was frozen. So basically, I just couldn't really use it for 3 years. And I just went to doctor after doctor after doctor after doctor. And it was depressing. It was one of the lowest times in my life because I felt hopeless and I felt like I was never going to get better. And I was definitely not reassured by Western medicine in any way. In fact, I usually got sicker when I went into the hospital. Vomiting, just from the dyes, from whatever they gave me. And I'm really sensitive to medication. So that wasn't serving me. And so out of desperation, out of these 3 years, and mind you, I'm still going to college, I had this attitude, and I think my body felt like it knew better. I think my body was always telling me, like, don't stop moving. And do not, whatever you do not accept this diagnosis that they are giving you. Because they told me, well, I guess you'll just never use your left arm again. Okay, that's my option. There's nothing. That was demoralizing to hear. And it put me in a pretty dark place. But at the same time, my body was always saying to me, don't listen to that. You don't have to accept that diagnosis. And I can remember going one time I thought, well, maybe Pilates, right? This was like the beginning of the surge of Pilates. And I had been a dancer. I continued dancing even when this arm didn't really work and even when I was in a lot of pain. It actually was my greatest opportunity to tap back into my body and to go in and to just be with what is. And I think that's part of what made it so hard. And it was also part of what made it so extraordinarily beautiful to have that experience of just living with what is. And to me, that's where the divine comes in. Because if you can find a way to do that, that is your highest spiritual calling, to just live with what is, to accept it. And at that time, I wasn't really a spiritual person. In fact, I had come from being a Jehovah's Witness. I was raised Jehovah's Witness, that's a whole nother podcast. We'll talk about that later, but it was hard. It wasn't for me. I'll say that. So I go through this experience, and my mother and I were so frustrated, and my mother finally said to me one day, what about acupuncture? I think we should just try it. I mean, what do we have to lose at this point? And she found this amazing woman. She was, in fact, a Chinese woman. She had this very quiet practice, just sort of hiding in this office building. And we went to go see her, and she had me sit down on a stool. She did some, basic muscle testing sort of things, just trying to assess what was going on with me. And she had me sit on a stool with my head and my arms resting on the massage table. And she put some needles in, ankles, I don't even remember. But then she put one needle in this big knot that we could never seem to get rid of in my shoulder. And she said, take a deep breath. And she had lit this, it wasn't sage. I don't know what she lit. But she lit this giant wand of some plant material. And then she placed it next to one of the needles in my neck and shoulders, and I passed out. I just dropped. It was this rush that came over me, and thank goodness I think she knew that was a possibility, which is why she had me resting on the table. So if I passed out, I didn't have far to go. And I just remember that feeling when you're about to pass out and you kind of feel sweaty and clammy and you just feel this rush. And that's what I felt. And then when I woke up, I was completely out of pain. I looked at my fingers. They weren't blue. I looked at my mom, started crying, and it seemed like a miracle. We both started crying. It was amazing. And the relief just in my body, in my psyche, it was this massive just transformation of just letting it all go. It was super powerful. And I was hooked. I was hooked on Eastern medicine from that moment on. And it's funny because I always thought I was going to be a doctor. Like, that was my biggest desire at the time, was to get into medical school. So I was taking a whole bunch of science classes, and I am a nerd. I do love science, and I love learning, and I just love nerdy stuff. And science, studying the body, studying anatomy, that was right up my alley. So when I look back on this accident, as awful as it was, I think it was my initiation, if you will, into a world that I was always intended to go into. And it seems to me that what happens, I work on people's bodies and work with people frequently. And what I've noticed is that when people are in pain, I see a lot of people in pain, and physical, mental, emotional, sometimes it's all of them. And usually I look at all of those facets of the person rather than just that one part of, maybe they come to me with a hip or a shoulder issue, but I'm looking at what else is happening in their lives. And that's part of what's wrong with our medical system, right? They only look at the part of you that they're trained in and that they're there to deal with. They're not looking at the whole of you. I think that's a shortcoming that we have. And it's really hard when you're in chronic pain to look at your life and say, what's the lesson here for me? And what can I learn about me, about my body, about my potential in that experience of whatever you're going through? And chronic pain is awful. There's nothing like waking up and going to bed every single day with pain and largely not knowing if it's ever going to get resolved. That is demoralizing. That is really hard to deal with. And so if you're out there listening to this podcast and you're experiencing chronic pain, my greatest longing for you is that you know there is hope. Things can always change, and the human body is designed to heal. That much I know. And I've seen, sometimes it takes people a really long time to recover. And then, we have the miraculous healings that happen seemingly instantly. And I just want you to know, I've experienced it. I know what that's like. And I'm here to, hopefully with this podcast and with some of what I have learned along the way, that I can inspire you, that I can remind you of the potential that you have and of what is available for you in terms of your ability to just be with what is. And all of those things are part of being a human, being, as they say, a divine spiritual being, having a human experience. And I think we've kind of got to shift that. In fact, I'm going to say we need to shift our thinking around our bodies, around what it means to be human. We have a lot of work to do, even on the spiritual front. There's so much I have to say about this particular topic, but my goal is, if I can do nothing else, is through this podcast, help remind you that, yes, being a human is hard, and we have some things that we could be focusing on around that. And I don't want you to forget the divinity that is within you. We seem to forget that a lot. And if you endeavor or you consider yourself to be a spiritual being, I would be willing to bet that there are some parts of you that you're leaving out, that you are forgetting, that you have become programmed to think that things are a certain way. And I'm not so sure that they are anymore. It's about expanding into a new way of thinking about who we are, about who we were, and expanding into ways of who we can and who we probably are going to become over these next few years. And over the course of this podcast, you're going to hear me talk a little bit about some astrology, cosmology. I think for me, I got into astrology probably it's during COVID. I got bored. I couldn't work on people except for from a distance. So I'm a Reiki master, and so I would have people call me, and they were losing their minds and struggling to be in their bodies. And so part of what I did was I offered long-distance healing sessions, which we're going to talk about that too, because it's amazing. And one of the things that I discovered was not only that I loved doing long-distance healing, was how beneficial it was. I knew it, but I didn't know the extent to which it could and would work. And so that was fun to almost experiment with that. But what I started getting into was astrology, and I started just taking some online courses and just learning as much as I could about it. And so, and when I look at people's astrologies, I do people's birth charts, and I'm not great at it. I've only been studying it, 6 years now, 5.5. And yet, wow, there is so much to learn. I feel like there's just as much to learn about the cosmos as there is about what it means to be human and what it means to be spiritual. It's like when you start going down the rabbit hole of getting yourself healthy again, when you start going down the rabbit hole of becoming a spiritual being, when you start to study astrology, there's so many layers to it, so many refinements, so many things to discover. And it is such a rich environment to put yourself in. And for me, when I can look at this person that I don't always know really well, sometimes I get somebody brand new into my life, and so I learn about them through their chart. But then when I talk to them and we have a conversation around what their experiences have been as a human thus far, it completely aligns with their chart. And so they wind up feeling really validated, really seen, really heard. And it's such a beautiful, it's just another part of us that we can learn about, that we can study, that we can maybe in some small way feel connected to the stars and feel like there's a reason we're here, right? Why are we here? That's the ultimate question. So my goal with this podcast, all of that, is to say that my intention behind this, and because this is, my first podcast. Welcome to my first podcast, everybody. And I look forward to getting to know you. I look forward to you getting to know me more. And my greatest wish for you is that we can just start to converse more and start to build a relationship around what does it mean to be human, because we are human, yes, and we are also really divine beings. And that word, redefining, when I began, even before I began writing my book, which is 3 years and I'm still working on it. But when this word redefining came to me, it feels like it was divinely handed to me. Because what kept coming up for me was that as a woman, as a human, even as a spiritual being, it seems like we're really quick to define what that means. Being a human is hard. Being a human is, it's a struggle. It's a challenge. Yes, and it's also extraordinarily beautiful. And for many of the people that I have worked on over the years, mostly women, some men, it's interesting how people have been very quick to define themselves by their pain. They have defined themselves by their past. They have defined themselves by their trauma. They have defined themselves by their limitations, by their family of origins, and to some degree, even their, what their jobs are, what their passions are. I hear less about that than I do about the pain and the past and the trauma and what has happened to them. And living that experience in my body, and for some reason, I think on a very soul level, my body would not let that define who I was. And it felt really very much in opposition to what was happening on my healing journey from that accident on, of being defined by my pain, being defined by my injury, being defined by what I was living with chronically. And it didn't feel right. It didn't feel good to me to be defined by those things that happened. And so it's a bit of a choice point that we get to make of, do we want to be defined by all of those things, or can we redefine the way that we view ourselves, the way that we perceive ourselves, and the person that we want to become? And there's an even bigger part of me that feels really strongly about the role that fear plays in our lives. And I'm gonna totally admit to the fact that I am someone who, like everybody, right? Like if I were to ask you, what do you fear the most? What's the thing that makes you want to shrink, contract, hide, be small? Is it speaking? Is it doing a podcast? I mean, I don't seem to have a problem speaking in front of people and being in front of the camera and all of those things. And yet for some people, a lot of people in my family, they're like, I don't know how you do that. Like, that's the last thing I want to be, is in front of a group of people and talking. And yet, for me, there's a small fear there. I admit to that. There's, kind of like, oh, I don't want to. But mostly the fear is that I'm going to get it wrong, that I'm going to make a mistake, or people aren't going to like me, right? But we have so many fears that dictate how we show up, who we show up with, how we don't show up, and we let ourselves be defined by those things that keep us small, that keep us within this little box of definition. And I think it's time that we start to look at who defines us, how do they define us, because for most of us, the world prefers that you stay small, that you don't be bigger and more fabulous and more amazing than them, than, what society dictates. And so I think the power that we have to redefine ourselves, for you to redefine yourself on your own terms, whatever those things are, understanding, and this is the key part, understanding that you are, as you sit here, as you're driving in your car listening to this, or out on your walk, or as you are taking a bath, or whatever it is that you're doing when you're listening to this podcast, that when you are doing that, you are sitting inside of one of the most sacred beings on earth. There's a reason you're here. There's a reason that you incarnated in the form that you did. And you chose that before you ever arrived. And if you can recognize on even the smallest amount of your being, on any level, if you can begin to understand that you are sitting inside of the most loving, benevolent, kind, generous vessels, a sacred vessel that was given to you, that if you can do that in any way, that you will begin to understand more fully what it means to be a spiritual being having a human experience. And it just gets juicier and richer and more amazing every time you come back to that remembrance. And when you can learn to sit in your vessel and to be okay with what is, that's really, to me, what it means to be a spiritual person, to be truly divine, is to remember that all is well and every part of you is welcome here. So thanks for listening to my podcast, and hopefully you find some resonance here. Hopefully you find some part of you in my conversation, in my story, because you are me, cleverly disguised as you.